Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 9, where we're talking about counseling Black and African American clients. So, our first reading was on being a Black Dominican, decentering whiteness in Latina, Latino, and Latinx narratives. So, essentially, what we're going to do is treat this chapter as both a first person narrative and a theoretical critique. So, we will unpack how colonial histories, US racial schemas, and professional discourses erase Afro Latine identities. So the poem at the beginning of the chapter stages a clash between imposed labels, Hispanic from Spain, and an embedded Africanness felt in the skin, hair, hips, and spirit. It names conquest and enslavement while refusing erasure. My Africa is still here. This is the naming work therapy must not avoid. So Latino is a US bureaucratic umbrella. On its own, it tells us almost nothing clinically salient. Country or people of origin, languages, whether they're Spanish, Indigenous, Creole, their self-identified races, their skin tone terms, migration generation, or religion. So what you want to do is replace this shortcut of Latino with specificity. Flattening intragroup differences or flattening intragroup difference overrepresents lighter-skinned archetypes from a few countries and marginalizes Caribbean, Indigenous, and Afro-Latine experiences. Clinically, what can be missed is colorism, potentially wrong language assumptions, or poor formulation. So making sure that you're attuned to the multiple realities and the intersection of multiple identities. In 19 from 19 I'm sorry, from 1492 onward, genocide and slavery imposed racial hierarchies and coerced mixing. Caste terms like mestizo, mulatto, zambo, etc., normalized Spanish white supremacy and stigmatized Blackness. These logics they still animate preferences, policies, and aesthetics. Unlike the US one drop black rule, Iberian systems rewarded proximity to whiteness. Families sought whitening via marriage, institutions validated it. Today, straightening hair, valorizing good hair or light eyes, and partner preferences often function as safety or status strategies. What you want to do here is name the structure, not just the symptom. So why do we move toward whiteness? Why is there a preference for that? So understanding that clinically. So Latin America is not a country. So Costa Rica is not Haiti, is not Peru, is not the Dominican Republic. So practically how you could employ this, employ this is during intake. Where is home? Who are your people? Which languages, so again, Spanish, Indigenous, Creole, do you speak? How does race work in that context? You want to map all of that before any acculturation. Like acculturation is a big piece of intakes. So you want to do any of that before you talk about their experience, um, potentially here in the United States or in another country. So disowning Blackness can be adaptive under violent and anti-Black conditions. For example, marry lighter, or that you may have pelo malo, or bad skin. Expect aesthetic shame, relationship conflict, and ambivalence. Intervene with decolonial education and affirmation of Afro-descendant aesthetics, history, and joy. Some white Latinx disavow white due to migration and class marginalities. You want to use a dialectical frame, which means two things can be true. You want to both validate the ethnic and national hardships while also examining where racial whiteness confers safety or access, for example, in things like policing, housing, and medicine. So, two things can be true. The goal here is to widen responsibility without erasing the hardship. So, the Hernandez's brother was assaulted essentially for a phenotype, not his nationality, which cued some risk. In the US, Spanish fluency doesn't shield Black Latinx from anti Black harm. Therapy should name Dominican and Black to correctly locate harm in structures, not in individual failings. So, understanding the person and all of their characteristics. So here, same as that dialectical approach, is a both and identity. So you want to support simultaneous anchors. So these anchors can be racial, national, linguistic, migratory, again, without ranking that, like, their racial identity is more important than their language or anything, or without erasure. So you don't want to oversimplify into just one of those parts. Um, Allowing space for all of them. So a both and identity heals the split created when Black and Latino are treated as mutually exclusive. Like I said from a previous slide, you want to operationalize specificity. So here's a way to do that. Where, who are the person's people? Where are they from? What's the migration story? What are their languages? How do they self-identify in terms of race? Talking about their skin and hair terms. Beauty rituals, their partner phenotype hopes, policing school encounters. So essentially, you're asking questions like, where is home for your family? Which peoples? What languages? How does your family talk about skin tone and hair? What kind of messages have you gotten about good looks or partners? What are your experiences with police, school, discipline, or medical care where appearance matters? How do colorism and anti-Blackness show up at home? You also want to move beyond competence to decolonial practice. Reframe preferences as survival scripts under whitening. So that blanqueamiento. Build counter stories centering Afro-Latina excellence in everyday joy. Use embodied practices like natural hair journeys, drumming, dance, visual art to repair any aesthetic shame. Pair this with letters, IEP advocacy, know your rights, and Afro-Latina community referrals. So you can see each of those aspects in the here in the slide covered. The umbrella label of Latino obscures what treatment needs. Make whiteness and anti-Blackness discussable. Both or build coherent both and identities. Marry narrative repair to advocacy so clients get safer schools, clinics, and streets, not just insights. This is taking the talk therapy and moving it, using some of your power to move that into advocacy. So those are some takeaways from this chapter. The next chapter was about Black genealogy, restoring an African American family. So this chapter discusses Pinter-Hughes' how the arc of their story. So how historical erasure of African Americans deforms identity and practice. We also go through the author's genealogical reconstruction as a narrative repair, and then giving some clinical implications around things like secrecy, emotional cutoffs, colorism, identification with the aggressor, then also Bowen's societal projection process. So for those of you who maybe have had theories one, or maybe are in it. Okay, so first we'll talk about the problem frame. Official histories have rendered African Americans invisible or distorted, producing ignorance among Black and white communities alike. sealing off the past, essentially refusing to recall humiliations, functioned as a survival adaptation to sustained trauma. The chapter's claim is paradoxical and important. Reopening painful history can be curative. Um, Knowledge of the past nourishes identity, increases present coping capacity, and orients further action. Okay, making sure. So Pinder-Hughes begins in 1977 to achieve greater integration and rootedness. She prioritizes the maternal line, but contrasts it with she prioritizes the maternal line, but contrasts it with paternal snapshots. Methodologically, she triangulates the US Census from 1870 to 1900 with parish registers, conveyance and deed books, slave sale ledgers, and Freedmen's Bank, supplemented by neighbors' and relatives' recollection. This is both scholarship and clinical intervention. Documentation becomes therapeutic artifact. A brief paternal vignette showcases resilience post-emancipation. A great-grandfather opens a bank account in 1869. Within a generation, the family includes multiple professionals. A relative stigmatized as an FBI stool pigeon is later documented as heroic. This foreshadows restoring, how framing alters identity and family myths. The maternal line is burdened by shame and silence, multiple mixed race births, white paternity unacknowledged, and early loss. Live Oak becomes the geographical and symbolic anchor, the site of family competence, tragedy, and community. Because pre-1870 enslaved people who were enslaved were counted as property, she had to first find the enslaver to trace the enslaved. She linked census entries, church baptisms that omit fathers, and slave sales, so Poindexter to Dunbar to LaPice, to reconstruct maternal ancestors. Crucially, she found the deed showing Live Oak as a multi-family cooperative purchase in 1871 and still in family hands, evidence of post-emancipation agency. The archive itself encodes domination. Enslaved people appear as inventory. Paternity is systematically erased unless marital. The church both owned slaves and mandated accurate records. Clinically, such erasure fosters identity fragmentation and intergenerational not knowing, a defensive learning style forged to survive overwhelming secrecy. Pinder-Hughes reframes the template for paternal abandonment. White men, backed by law and custom, fathered children they never acknowledged. Miscegenation anxieties produced locked archives and terror around ancestry. She decoupled racist myths by contrasting Yoruba kinship norms where pregnancy implies marriage, illuminating how U.S. racism manufactured the absent Black father narrative. Some ancestors internalize proximity to power. So, for example, house rules, reproduced color hierarchies, and developed elitist defenses. Clinically, this is identification with the aggressor, an adaptive but costly strategy that fuses self-worth with dominant standards, undermining differentiation and solidarity. So counter narratives matter. The same family embodies robust strengths: cooperative land ownership, efficient household economy, mutual care networks, and religious and cultural life. These are resources to enlist in therapy, evidence of competence, not deficiency. Power concentrates in the matriarch to keep the system viable. Alec's role, he's the loving protector, rearing children fathered by absent white men. This illustrates gendered strain produced by racial sexual politics. The task is to hold ambivalence without pathologizing. Both care and undermining can coexist. Ali's light skin generates contradictory positions, idealized, idealized and expelled, leading to exile from home, chronic depression, and role reversal, where the daughter becomes her confidant and therapist. Colorism is not cosmetic. It reorganizes attachment, shame, and symptom depression or symptom expression. Restorying, linking personal, familial, and political history, transforms shame into coherent identity. Naming secrets and contradictions reduces fusion and emotional cutoffs. These are terms from Bowen. Reconnection to kin frees energy from present functioning. Pride in genuine strengths counterbalances inherited contempt. So Bowen's societal projection process explains how dominant groups stabilize themselves by placing anxiety and contradiction into lower groups. Even benevolence can be self-serving, stabilizing the helper's status while leaving structures intact. Both beneficiaries and victims are entrapped by these roles, including clinicians. So graduate level assessment nests micro patterns with macro history, enslavement, miscegenation law, church state record keeping. You can enrich your genograms by marking skin tone, paternal absence, and secrecy. You also want to name adaptations like elitism, oppositionality, in identification with the aggressor, and have these all marked as survival strategies rather than traits to be pathologized. Another clinical implication here is to use documents, deeds, baptismal entries, letters, all as therapeutic artifacts. You want to structure witnessing. So, for example, outsider witness practices to transform secrets. You want to work systematically to redistribute caregiving, address parentification, and reduce fusion. You want to connect clients to community legacies like cooperative economies, faith networks that can scaffold their resilience. You also want to interrogate your own social location and the gravitational pull of quick, decontextualized fixes. Make power roles discussable in therapy. Invite and witness both victims and beneficiaries' narratives to loosen societal projection. Ethical practice sustains context, not just techniques. History actively shapes system topography and family organization. Restorying converts secrecy and shame into coherence and connection. Lasting change couples clinical work with structural attention to witnessing, role redistribution, and community building. Then the next chapter that we read was what it has to do with us from individual blame to systems change. So, why we're talking about our why talking about privilege might feel risky is an important thing to consider. We also want to talk about why it feels risky, why it's still necessary, and how shifting from individuals to systems gives us leverage. So, what I want to do is talk about some key concepts like socialization, the paths of least resistance, and participation, and then hopefully give you some meaningful takeaways. So, why this is hard. Conversations trigger self-protection. Many of us were socialized to dodge guilt rather than face patterns. Dominant groups often recenter themselves. Naming this makes room for listening, the centering. The lower risk move isn't avoidance, it's reframing the problem from bad people to systemic patterns. Individualism claims that if we explain people, we've explained society. That logic personalizes systemic harm and blocks coalition, especially from would-be allies who don't see themselves as the bad ones. So it also erases category-based advantage because it sees only persons, not positions. So privilege ultimately becomes invisible. So a university, a firm, a neighborhood are systems you participate in. You aren't the system itself. Patterns like graduation rates and pay gaps reflect structures and the ways participants enact them, not just intention. So systems are not just people, um, they're larger than that. From family to media, we absorb categories, values, and ranks. When heroes, leaders, and geniuses default to one group, members of that group infer entitlement, and others infer lesser status. These messages sit underneath daily interactions. So, systems guide our behavior through paths of least resistance. Social situations come preloaded with default moves. You only notice a norm when you violate it and feel pushback. So, the example here is facing the back of an elevator instead of facing the door. We take for granted that we all face the door in an elevator. So, when somebody faces the back, it's a norm that is bucked or violated, and it makes people uncomfortable. Privilege is maintained through these defaults, not just explicit decision. So resistance reveals an invisible path. So, if you were to walk into an elevator and see someone facing the wall, you might go, I didn't even know that was an option to not face the door. So the least resistance isn't always easy. People can hate a task and still follow orders. Euphemisms soften cognitive dissonance. So um, people who have to perform layoffs, in peer groups, fear of ostracization deters intervention. So there's like a social risk, for example, to call out a sexist joke. Am I going to be seen as a prude? Am I going to be that person who has no sense of humor? So these are the ordinary mechanism that keep patterns intact. So people worried about how they are perceived. Participation is a two-way street. We enact systems so we can enact them differently. Forced in the Greensboro sit-ins, 4 students altered the script for lunch counters, and diffusion followed. Small deflections can cascade when they're repeated. So we create the systems, we can change them. The same person, the Monopoly analogy, so the game rewards extraction and a winner takes all. We act greedy in the game, but not necessarily outside of it. And so the takeaway is the context and the roles load the odds. So the same person in a different behavior when the roles define success as others lose. The point isn't that we're secretly greedy, it's that systems organize incentives and defaults. And in order to change outcomes, we have to change the rules and roles. The accusation frame triggers shame and denial. So being called, for example, a racist or a sexist. The systems frame recognizes unintended complicity. So, for example, professors taking men more seriously without conscious bias. And then this widens who sees themselves as part of the solution. So, this is what involvement really means. So overt haters exist, but they aren't the engine. Targets are culturally taught, and we want to focus on the system that directs the energy. We must address violent actors, but systemic devaluation supplies their targets. Culture teaches who is less protected, and so dismantling this is prevention. So we are, as part of a global economy and consumers, we are part of a complicit group contributing to this as well. So our consumption connects to systems we don't see. You don't need to intend harm to be part of a harmful arrangement. So harsh labor conditions built into price, as we know, like little humans creating pieces, um, deforestation for it. So if you acknowledge this, it opens space for ethical redesign. So if we acknowledge that as consumers we are part of the problem, then we can make some changes. Um, collective F collective effects emerge from tiny units of action and inaction. This is both sobering because harm adds up and empowering because so does change. By doing nothing, we reduce the societal cost or the social cost of harmful practices. Normalizing speaking up raises the cost of the status quo. So if we make a collective commitment to speaking up, then we make visible the status quo or these taken for granted just patterns that exist that are harmful. So if we name them in the moment, we're making them more conscious to other people. Um, so making some of these practical reframes, like from who's to blame to what's the game, from bad apples to these are the rules, roles, and rewards of this system. So looking at who's to blame on a personal level, transforming that to what's the game. I'm just thinking about like billionaires, like they're easy to blame, and capitalism is essentially the game, and it encourages hedonism or gathering as much as you can and never being fulfilled by what you have. So instead of naming people as bad apples, that you're looking at rules, roles, and rewards of the system. So I'm also not here saying like give people a complete pass. It's widen your lens. You can see that like there are bad apples and that bad apples can be fostered through a system. So I want you to widen your lens to like what are these people acting in? And then also from fixed people to shift paths of least resistance. So you want to diagnose structure before assigning fault. You want to examine the incentives, defaults, and gatekeeping and make the right thing the easier thing. So how to change paths? Through mentoring, through meetings, in hiring, being a different type of bystander. You want to engineer new defaults, then back them with training and metrics. Measure who speaks and gets credit. Design processes that counter bias. You pre-rehearsed responses lower the interpersonal cost of intervening. So if you have some sort of training to give language to people to speak up, they may be more apt to do so. So here you want to keep the focus on how patterns happen, not on worthiness. So name systems, not just sinners. You want to connect the dots between good intentions and systemic effects. And then you always close with an action someone can take immediately. So these are things you can talk about in your clinical practice. These are things you can talk about with each other. So your role, you are already involved. Participation is non-optional. The only choice left is how to be involved. And you have power and responsibility with that choice. We don't get to opt out of participation. We do choose our stance. That's the locus of agency, to reproduce or to redirect. So some take homes here. Understanding the people system dynamic gives us leverage. Defaults can be redesigned. Culture can be rescripted. You want to aim for visible, repeatable changes that make the better path the easier one. All right, then moving to our articles for the week. Um, the first article, Mental Health Services in Faith Communities, the role of clergy in Black churches. This article reviews evidence that Black churches are indispensable mental health touchpoints, why clergy often become first-line helpers, what churches already do, and how practitioners can partner ethically and effectively with them. So we'll cover some help-seeking patterns, strengths and risks of clergy-led responses, determinants of church capacity, and hopefully some actionable practice implications. So sociology and social work document the Black church's centrality across domains. Survey evidence shows near census that Black churches play many positive roles, reinforcing their trust, reservoir, and visibility. This positioning explains why churches are natural gateways for health and mental health engagement. National data show clergy are a dominant help source for serious problems, especially where unmet need is high. Contact is direct, not referral mediated, lowering stigma and logistical barriers. Pastoral visiting route norms and pre-existing relationships further ease engagement and trust. Ministers don't only handle spiritual support, they routinely hear clinically significant concerns. Help seeking varies systematically. Religious orientation and involvement predict where people turn. Within Black populations, women consult clergy more often, and bereavement is a prime trigger for minister contact, often followed by high satisfaction and limited subsequent specialist use. Comparative data from catchment areas show clergy encounter similar types of severities of problems as clinicians. That makes their gatekeeping function pivotal. Accurate recognition and timely referral can change trajectories, but the system must support them to do so. Older but instructive studies show clergy can underestimate psychosis and suicidality and sometimes read severe symptoms as spiritual conflict, delaying specialty care. Only a small minority refer consistently. These findings motivate structured training, information exchange, and clear referral ladders. Black churches operate extensive community programming. Beyond mutual aid, nearly 1/5 provide counseling and intervention, and many partner with agencies. This infrastructure can be leveraged for stepped care, screening days, and warm handoff referral models. Larger, better resourced churches predictably run more and more specialized programs. Physical space and paid staff enable continuity. Member socioeconomic status affects donation and grant readiness. These structural factors shape what partnerships can reasonably expect. Clergy education correlates with community engagement and referral behavior. Racial consciousness is linked to outreach. Bivocational pastors may have limited capacity despite commitment. These determinants guide partner selection and role design. Classic North Carolina models demonstrate that health promotion anchored in churches can scale. Networked relationships, like memorandum of understanding, regular case conferences, and bidirectional training create reliable pipelines for referral and follow-up. So you can start with a census and deep profile of area churches. You can build presence via recurring touch points and assign liaisons who become trusted faces. Gender matching can matter. You want to use co-branding and collocation to lower stigma and transport barriers. Provide clergy with clear referral procedures and red flag checklists, and ask clergy to teach about spiritual framing of grief, illness, and meaning. You can expect principled differences and protect the partnership. Clarify roles, agree on privacy, consent, data sharing, and boundaries, and plan for sensitive content. Acknowledge historical harms and examine your own biases to foster a durable collaboration. Most studies are small and descriptive, and these authors call for more rigorous sampling, validated measures of recognition and referral accuracy, implementation determinants, and outcome-linked evaluations of church agency models to inform scaling decisions. Treat churches as core community assets. Build structured bidirectional ties that respect ethics and context. Strengthen clergy recognition and referral, and exploit church infrastructure for equitable access. Done well, these partnerships measurably improve engagement and outcomes. Okay, so I think our final reading for the week. So ultimately, this article synthesizes findings from focus groups with 201 African American adults about psychotherapy, why people go, what gets in the way, and how clinicians can respond. So, despite decades of work, African Americans are less likely to initiate outpatient care and more likely to terminate early, while often overrepresented in crisis and emergency pathways. Research on racial and ethnic therapist matching shows benefits for engagement and retention in some contexts, but not consistent outcome effects. So racial match alone isn't going to doesn't solve the problem. Focus groups let participants name barriers and solutions in their own hands, critical for designing services that people will actually use. So groups ranged from 3 to 12 participants. Recruitment was community-based. Participants received a modest stipend. Transcripts and field notes were coded independently and reconciled by consensus to derive stable themes. As a qualitative design, this offers depth over generalization. This is ideal for identifying leverage points for practice change. Help seeking was tied to serious thresholds, psychosis, severe mood symptoms, and acute risk. Traumas were widely recognized as warranting professional help. For everyday stress, willingness varied. Many still defaulted to informal supports. Terminology mattered. Psychotherapy gave the connotation of crazy, whereas counseling felt practical and problem solving. Language choices can lower the threshold for engagement. Participants named long-standing cultural values, handling handling problems internally and maintaining family privacy. There's a strength and toughness script, this was especially salient for men that can make help seeking feel like failure. Women described being expected to contain and carry emotional load, which can delay their own care. Importantly, many participants challenged these norms, noting the health costs of, quote, just toughing it out. Stigma was universal. Both those with and without prior care described shame and embarrassment. Some used emergency rooms to avoid being seen going to a mental health setting, which was an expensive workaround that rarely offers continuity. And so destigmatizing language and entry points matter. Participants perceived therapy as financially out of reach. When insured, psychotherapy availability felt limited relative to medication. Many didn't know what services existed or how to assess when problems warranted care. Navigation help and transparent pricing and scheduling can be as pivotal as the therapy itself. The church remained a central hub for some, though participants noted variable confidentiality and expertise. When clergy are first line, warm handoffs to clinicians are crucial to avoid dead ends. Participants often viewed psychologists as removed from community realities, both racially and socioeconomically. Credentials alone don't inspire trust, visible community presence and relatable demeanor did. Mistrust isn't abstract, it's tied to specific risks, being judged, mislabeled, or harmed by systems. So relational signals like calm, competence, curiosity, and being transparent repeatedly cited as antidotes. Participants favored therapies that teach coping strategies they can use between sessions. They wanted to know why a diagnosis mattered and how it links to treatment choices. Autonomy matters. Advice giving or directive tell me what to do approaches were viewed skeptically. Many endorsed a principle that race shouldn't be determinative, but they also described concrete ways it does shape safety and disclosure. Socioeconomic distance, so middle or upper middle class providers felt as alienating as racial distance. So socioeconomic distance felt as alienating as racial distance. For some topics, especially sexual trauma, gender matching felt protective. A one size fits all rule to bring up race in session one can backfire. Gauge racial identity, prior discrimination experiences, distress level, and the therapeutic alliance. Explain why the topic matters for this client's goals before diving in. Small framing changes, like from counseling, stress management, or skills for coping, can lower stigma. Satellite clinics and hospitals or community hubs meet people where they are and reduce travel and visibility barriers. Build explicit pathways from clergy ER to ongoing care, so first contacts don't become last contacts. Clarify Our clarity and early tangible improvements sustain engagement. Demystify confidentiality up front. What is shared, with whom, and when. So, for example, schools, courts, insurers, to address the fear of systems. Shared agendas each session reinforce collaboration and respect. Participants scanned environments for signals of inclusion and safety, so small details mattered. The artwork, reading materials. Don't sidestep the everyday stressors participants highlighted: paying bills, balancing roles, neighborhood trauma. If a race conversation lands poorly, name it, correct it, and keep the alliance central. So, the core message: when people see care that is respectful, understandable, practical, and culturally attuned, they use it. But those elements, or build those elements in to the first contact.